Salutations! This is Volts, and I'm your host, David Roberts. Electricity transmission has been having a moment lately, getting more attention from analysts and policymakers than it has in, well, at least in my lifetime. There's a good reason for this. Every single model of deep decarbonization shows that to get there, the U.S. will need lots more long-distance, high-voltage power lines to get renewable energy from the remote areas where it is concentrated to the urban load centers where it is needed. The problem is the current system for planning and building those long-distance power lines is utterly dysfunctional at every level, which means they aren't getting built. The U.S. will not decarbonize on time or on budget unless it can figure this out. It's a thorny, complicated subject, not just understanding all the flaws in the current process, but figuring out how to move forward with solutions. Loyal Volts subscribers will recall that I wrote a 5-part series on these issues earlier this year, but if you're looking for a more compact and polished version, I highly recommend a newly released report jointly produced by the Niskanen Center and the Clean Air Task Force called How Are We Going to Build All That Clean Energy Infrastructure? The report emerged from a workshop held with a variety of professionals across the industry and serves as a plain language summary of the problems facing transmission in the U.S. today and the candidate solutions. It is remarkably readable, even for non-nerds. I recommend checking it out. To walk through those problems and the possible solutions, I'm excited to have as my guest today Liza Reed, the Research Manager for Low Carbon Technology Policy at Niskanen. Reed completed and defended a dissertation on these very issues just a few years ago and has been a crucial help to me in parsing through them. So I'm thrilled she's joining me today so that Volts listeners can also benefit. Liza Reed, welcome to Volts.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
So you've just, the Niskanen Center has just come out with this report about transmission and its many challenges. So I thought the best way to structure the conversation would be to kind of walk through the report a little bit. But first, sort of by way of context, tell us, what is the transmission challenge in the United States? What are the decarbonization models telling us about what we need?
The challenge is that we don't have enough transmission and that we need more transmission. And we don't.
Pretty simple.
Yep, it's that simple. And we don't have the right mechanisms in place to get the kind of transmission that we need.
But when we say need more, like relative to what we have, are we talking like a 20% increase, doubling, tripling? Give us a ballpark figure.
There's sort of a range of estimates that come out of reports, but generally in the double to triple in the capacity is what we're seeing coming out of these decarbonization reports. So that's in the gigawatt miles is sort of the metric.
And we're not building anywhere close to that pace.
Exactly. Not at the speed we need, and particularly not at the type that we need, because transmission is being built. And this is one of the challenges when we talk about this decarbonization challenge, is that there is transmission being built, but transmission is generally defined as anything over 100 kilovolts. And the type of transmission that is going to move a lot of power quickly and over long distances is 500 kilovolts, on that high range. So there's a ton of gigawatt miles being built between 100 kilovolts and sort of 345 kilovolts compared to what we're getting at these higher voltages that can transfer a lot more power, go a lot longer distances, that provide a different kind of resilience and access to different power in different geographic regions.
Right. So the ones that are getting built are generally, I guess local's not quite the right word, but sort of like a utility will build a line within its territory to connect or strengthen two of its.
Exactly.
And what we need are these longer ones between territories, between regions, possibly national. So we're nowhere close on track. And so let's go through the way you structure the report is around the 5 Ps of transmission. So I thought we would walk through the Ps and what's going wrong with them currently. The first one is planning. So, as I understand it, basically utilities have their own planning processes, and that's basically what they use to decide on transmission. But then there are other entities also planning, and then there are other entities jumping into the system without planning at all. So tell us what's going on with planning right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is planning at different scales. You're correct. And the largest scale on which planning occurs is within what's called a regional transmission organization, an RTO, or an ISO, an independent system operator.
Yeah, let me pause you there, because just in case there are a few people listening who are not yet total energy nerds, we need to start with a quick distinction. There are two sort of general kinds of utility areas. One is with the fully vertically integrated utility, is what it's called. They
Mhm.
own the generation, the transmission, the interface with the households. They own everything. And then there are these other areas, which I think cover about 2/3 of customers, where the generation has been broken off into an independent business.
Mhm.
The utilities are just there to deliver the power to the households. And then you have these regional transmission organizations that kind of oversee these areas and try to coordinate them. It's a little bit of basic boring background for anybody who's not clued into that.
That's absolutely perfect. And they are member organizations, which I think is also important, right? They are organizations of utilities for the most part.
Right, as opposed to outside authorities that might have contrary interests or be able to impose contrary interests.
Right, and they're not building it themselves, right? I mean,
Right.
they are part of they are bringing those stakeholders together in pursuit of particular goals, which are largely established by FERC, about
Mhm.
what these regional RTOs or ISOs should be doing. But they are member organizations, right? So they are conveners and collaborators, and they are managing this transmission planning process. But at the end of the day, it is still those members and those utilities who have to build the transmission.
So is it the case that then the RTO has brings all its member utilities together and makes something like a regional transmission plan, but then all the individual utilities also have their individual plans?
I think that's right. It's sort of challenging when we talk about transmission, and why I say I think that's right is that if you and I each put our finger on different points in the United States, the system would be different there.
All right.
And I'm jumping ahead to the P for process.
It's the overriding piece. It applies to all these.
That's correct. That's correct. But right, for the most part, that's true. And that's where what you mentioned earlier, these local reliability projects, which is often what they're called, right? That is often more of an internal
Mm.
to a utility approach. And then these larger planning approaches, again, required by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, are about how the utilities plan on how they work together and what they might need across the system. But that still has a boundary, right? So we have utility boundaries, we have these RTO boundaries, and then inter RTO planning or inter ISO
Mm.
planning happens in theory. And I mean, technically happens in reality, but
And it happens by the two RTOs getting together
yep.
in a room somewhere, or
There was actually a great post just earlier this week about two RTOs. I believe it was Mid-Continent ISO. I believe it was MISO and PJM, and it's a single slide that says interregional planning approach. This year, we decided we don't need anything. There's really nothing that we both need,
we're good.
so we're moving on. But that's the problem. If you have to plan everything within your footprint, and they do, right? They do all this planning within their footprint with their own set of metrics and their own priorities. Yeah, I can imagine that you get together and you're like, well, I figured myself out and you figured yourself out, right? Like you and
Mm,
your neighbor have a fence between your yards. You're not co-planting a tree, you know?
right. So you have planning taking place at regional transmission organizations, which in theory should at least get you to regional planning, right? I mean, at least it's bigger than a single utility territory, but it doesn't seem to actually result in regional lines.
Right? Because there's a lot of barriers to regional planning, and there's the technical aspect of regional planning, and then there's the what do we call it? Implementation aspect,
Mhm.
right? Where the entire electricity system is a engineering solution, right?
Right.
And one of the most important facets, I think, of engineering is that there's lots of ways to get to the end state that you need.
Right.
And so you can do it with large interregional lines, interutility lines. I mean, this is, again, what the studies have shown. That is currently projected to be the least expensive way to reach the ends that we need. There are more expensive ways to reach the ends that we need. And some of those are more attractive to certain stakeholders because there's an onus of control there. There's a clarity, right? I know that every dollar I invest is resulting in benefits to my system.
Right.
And when we have to share a project, do I feel like I'm getting proportionally the benefits that I'm paying for? And that's where a lot of these lines fall apart before they can be completed, or even before the plan can be finished, right? You look at the system, you identify potential areas, but then you also identify potential solutions. And then you've got to pick amongst those solutions about what member organizations are interested in. And it can be very difficult to get these projects agreed upon if member entities feel like they have to pay for something that they're not getting a benefit from.
Right. And a curveball in all this, there are the what are called merchant lines, which are not planned or built by utilities, but are being planned and built by sort of external market participants, which then aren't part of the utility planning or the RTO planning. As I understand it, they just kind of get bolted on if they can pass the test. So how does that work? I guess two questions here, sort of for my own background. What sort of percentage of transmission lines are merchant lines? Like, how big of a presence are independent transmission builders in this whole process? And then B, like, how do they fit in the planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we think about these independent lines, right, that aren't part of the process, because there are some transmission organizations, right? There are some developers that build transmission, but they are within the process, right? It's part of sort of a competitive bidding process. But outside of the process of that traditional planning process, merchant lines are an incredibly small, I mean, approaching zero.
Oh, really?
But because it's so difficult to get these lines built, right? It's because of all of these barriers
Right.
to being outside of the process. You still, you said bolted on. That's actually quite a barrier. Getting bolted onto the system is no small piece of the puzzle.
Right. So you got planning. The term you used in the report is balkanized. You got sort of multiple entities planning. It's sort of like two problems. One, there's like a bunch of different entities planning, but then two, there's no sort of integrative process that brings all these plans together and makes sense of them. So you end up with balkanized planning, but then also balkanized building. You just get these sort of little regional, or even like local lines, but very few of the longer ones we need.
Right. And the boundaries are also a challenge because utility boundaries often do not fall within a state, right? They are often crossing
Right.
state lines. And so the utilities perspective versus the state regulator's perspective on what the benefits are.
Right. So you could see something that would be benefiting a state, but not the utility, and vice versa in some cases.
Mhm, mhm.
So planning's a mess. That's the first. That's the first P. The second P is even more of a mess. It's permitting,
Mhm.
and then here also, this is like I struggle to describe this to people because it's so crazy. But basically, any jurisdiction you cross over, or any entity you cross over, if you're proposing building a line, you need to get a permit, and that can be true at the state level, the county level. There could be private landowners level. Like, there's just a million levels of permits. So like, describe the thicket to us, sort of like who all do I have to get a permit from if I want to go across like 3 states and whatever, 100 theoretically privately owned pieces of land.
So in some states, it's at the state level. You go to the state commission and they give you the certificate that gives and has the siting board and those together. The certificate of CPCN, it's a certificate of public convenience and necessity. And then the siting is what determines the line, right? The siting is where the line is actually going to go. The certificate is essentially the right to build. And with the certificate comes the ability to exercise eminent domain if
Mm.
necessary, right? If that route that is selected, if the developer is not able to enter into private agreements with
Mm-hmm.
the landowners along that route, then they can exercise eminent domain through holding this certificate from.
And just pausing here, let's explain eminent domain. It basically just means you can take the land and they can't stop you, right? I mean, is
Right.
it that
Just
simple?
compensation, right? You have to give them some just compensation, but it can be, right, the land can be taken by the state
Right.
for this purpose.
But then there are other entities involved in
Right.
permitting it in other states.
So state level is the best case scenario. And even that is if every state you cross needs to, so your best case scenario right now is that you are crossing two states where both states have state level siting and state level permitting.
Mm-hmm.
And both states are getting enough benefit from this line that it passes their metrics for allowing the line to be built.
Right, because each of them are thinking, when they're making their permitting decision, are just thinking about what does it do for our state. Like statutorily, I think they're sort of
Right. Often that is exactly.
confined to thinking about specifically what does this do for our state.
Exactly. And there are a few states where regional interest is actually in the statute, but few.
Hmm.
And how do you show that, right? Like, what's the metric for demonstrating that?
Yeah, is there anything like a common? I mean, when these states are making decisions about does this transmission line benefit our state enough to warrant a permit, are there? If I'm a line developer, do I know what to expect, or are there common criteria for what counts as benefit or metrics or anything like that?
There are not. Generally speaking, you expect reliability to be a metric and cost to be a metric,
Hmm.
where reliability is actually explicitly defined by the North American Electric Reliability. Oh shoot, I forget the C. It might be
NERC.
council. Yeah,
Yeah,
NERC.
it's probably a council or a commission. It's one of those.
Yeah.
Definitely one of those.
Yep. So reliability is often defined by NERC, and so that is a common metric. Are we adding reliability to the system? But then there's a cost question as well. And again, depending on what state you're in or how the process goes, and depending on what the utility state relationship is, how that cost gets considered is very interesting, whether it gets evaluated at the front end or evaluated at the back end,
Mm.
where some utilities rely on cost recovery from their state commissions, right? So you put in the capital expenditure and then after the fact do a rate case and say, here's the money that we spent, here's how we benefited our ratepayers and our consumers, but here's why we now need to raise the rate to pay ourselves back for this risk that we took in this capital expenditure.
Right.
But a lot of times those conversations actually get pulled forward too, right? Though technically it's not approving the rate case before it gets built, there's still that discussion of, well, what are the benefits? Is this going
Right.
to lower cost? Who is it going to lower cost for?
Right. And if you, one thing you point out in the report is if you want to build a really long line, you're going to, at least in some cases, be crossing a state where you're just crossing the state. You're
Mhm.
not, there's not direct benefit to the state
Right.
other than the sort of larger regional or national benefit of having this line. And so, do we have examples of states sort of permitting lines that are like that just come through them? Or is that just like you're screwed if you need a state to let you do that?
Well, this is one of the challenges that high voltage direct current has because it is more expensive to build what's called a tap off station, right? Or a substation.
Right.
That's more expensive in HVDC systems. And so you're more likely to try to get by with just a cut through. If you have an AC line, a substation is proportionally pretty low cost. So
Mhm.
you can just tap off some power.
Right. So an AC line, you can dump power into the state and then create that benefit. But with a high voltage direct current line, creating an off ramp where you can dump some of your energy off the line into that state is actually a big chunk of capital cost.
Indeed. That off ramp can even be important for meeting the state guidelines to even be in the conversation in the first place.
Mm.
There were one of the Clean Line, so Clean Line Energy Partners was trying to develop a couple of different high voltage direct current lines. And one of the issues that they ran into was that in one of the states, they were trying to cut through initially, but if transmission lines are being built in the state, they have to be approved by the state the state commission, but the state commission only recognizes utilities that serve the state as a eligible entity to come before them to build transmission.
Oh, huh.
Right. And so
It's a catch-22.
Sure, not exactly a catch-22, right? Because but yes, it's tricky for sure, and certainly more tricky for HVDC.
Is that what ended up killing some of those clean line projects, the cut-through states?
I find it difficult to point to one thing that killed the clean line projects, because often those
Right.
projects are great examples of just how fraught it is, right?
Right.
So many pieces that slow you down. There's patient capital, and then there's, I don't even know what we're asking for. When you're 10 years down the road and you haven't broken ground on anything.
Yeah, no capital is that patient. What is the alternative? What are the other levels of permits that sometimes you have to deal with?
In Georgia, siting goes county by county.
Yikes.
Yeah.
So that means you're literally, like, what does it mean to get a permit from a county? Are you sending a representative to a county board, or like how big of a hassle is a process for getting a county?
Likely that. I mean, you are putting this case before the county, and there's so much more uncertainty about where the line can go, right? Because if there's objection in one county that requires a line to be moved, and there's a where it crosses a county line, now might impact that siting opportunity in the adjacent county.
Right. And if you think, if the state is sort of insular and only looking at its own interests, I imagine that's doubly so for a county. Like, do you have to prove that you're going to benefit each county you go through? I'm not even sure how that would work.
I'll be honest, I don't know either. We would have to talk to a developer who's gone through the process to know what that looks like.
And then also, aren't private landowners, don't they get involved somehow around these processes?
Sure. So if your land is being potentially taken under eminent domain, if you can't come to an agreement with the developer on a private agreement on the access or use of your land, or agreement on an easement or purchase, but the siting is approved, then there's the eminent domain process. Prior to that, right, private landowners and community members and local interests get involved at the siting, at the point of siting decision, right, at community meetings with siting boards regarding their concerns about the line for their property values, their concerns about the use of the line. Some of them are quite legitimate, right? This line is, you've misunderstood where the well is on my property, and you can't be this close to the well, right? Or this is cutting through my farm, and if we can move it over here to the edge of my farm, this is better for everyone involved. Others are, I mean, I've read a number of dockets, and inevitably people are concerned about being close to high voltage power lines.
Oh, it's going to mess up their 5G chips in their head or stuff like that? Are there
Sure.
are there similar?
Yes, there are a host of I believe firmly held but inaccurate beliefs about the health impacts. Now, typically those do not sway in fact, I have never seen those sway a docket in front of a public commission. But all of these sort of different voices are coming to the fore about where this line should go, if it should go there at all. Often arguments about where the power is coming from, where the power is going. Shouldn't we all do this locally?
Right.
And these are, I have a lot of sympathy for that perspective, because I think one thing that transmission is not in the common lexicon when everybody's talking about energy.
Right.
And as community members, you think about local solar and rooftop solar, and those are the things that are relevant often to individual landowners. And the recognition that those are part of the solution but cannot serve the entire need, that's a hard sell in many cases.
Right. And if you're a developer trying to plow across, whatever, multiple states, multiple counties, multiple private pieces of land, that means educating each one of those individual entities about that, which I imagine can be time consuming and exhausting. So that's the second P, permitting, which is, if we could summarize the problem, we're talking about interregional high voltage long distance lines that would benefit the nation, but there's no national permitting. All the entities that are permitting are looking at their own narrower interests and just are creating basically one hurdle after another.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And then the third P is paying, which is always, of course, a problem in any sort of project development of any kind. But tell us a little bit about how these things get paid for. It's somewhat different if you're a vertically integrated utility. Obviously, you just build the line and then charge your ratepayers
Mm-hmm.
to pay for it. And that at least seems straightforward. But then once you are going between utilities or between states, that's where things get complicated. So how does that work?
So the challenge here is in the biz is called cost allocation. That's
Right.
the difficulty. And it's sort of self-defining. Cost allocation is how you are allocating costs. And FERC requires that costs be allocated among beneficiaries, and non-beneficiaries are not forced to participate in allocating the cost for a line that does not do them any benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two challenges here, right? On the one hand, you've got to decide how to share the costs among the people who are beneficiaries, but you also have to agree on how to define the beneficiaries.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, who counts as a beneficiary and who decides that?
Right, right. Great question. And everybody has a different answer, right? Every RTO has a different answer, and then utilities and developers have different perspectives. Is a generator a beneficiary of transmission? Because without transmission, they're not getting their power onto the grid.
Right.
Right? Is the next door utility, maybe that's not, that substation isn't in their footprint, but what level of reliability improvement do they get that before it becomes something that they should participate in supporting?
Right.
The geographic footprint of these systems is actually quite large because for the most part, our electricity system is integrated, right? It is all touching each other. And so that power is flowing in lots of places.
Right. And you get into these sort of like second order benefits, third order benefits, like in some attenuated sense, everyone in the country benefits from,
Mm-hmm.
easing regional congestion and stuff like that, and just reducing the cost of wholesale power. Those benefits, cascade out.
And they're not static.
Right.
When you add a new generation somewhere on the system, the benefit of that transmission line to the system is now altered. When you add another transmission line somewhere else, the benefit of an earlier transmission line is altered.
Right. And so once you make this determination about cost allocation and who pays for what, it's fixed. Like can you go back and revise it when things like that happen and change the equation?
So my understanding is that different RTOs have different approaches to this.
That seems like a common theme here.
Yep, that is correct. We haven't even discussed that not the entire country is covered by RTOs, right? Most of the West, right, is not even covered by an RTO, and they have a completely different system that please don't ask me about. But in some of them, there is, sort of a medium term cost allocation and then a revisiting. I'm not familiar enough to dive into the details of how that process is worked out and managed, but that's certainly another financial risk for everyone involved.
And so just kind of summarizing the basic problem here is FERC has sort of said, you got to allocate costs among all the beneficiaries, even if we're talking multiple utilities, multiple states, but it has not specified in any very concrete way what the hell that means or who counts as a beneficiary or how you go through that process of cost allocation. So everyone's kind of winging it on their own. And often when multiple utilities have to get together and figure these things out, it just kind of grounds out in disagreements and no one can come to an agreement. And so once again, you see the incentives pushing utilities to just build stuff within their own territory. So paying is our third P, our third mess. It's worth saying those are sort of the traditional three Ps that people have thought about: planning, permitting, and paying. You add a couple more. One is participation. And I have some serious questions about this. that I want to get to later when we start talking about solutions. But just tell me, it's sort of like, are there any rules and guidelines now for participation, or what passes as participation now, or what exactly do you mean by participation?
Right. So I'm going to pause here, Dave. I'm not sure how to answer this question. I'll come up with an answer shortly, but I'm about to not make friends with the answer to this question. Uh, because
Good. It's a podcast about transmission. We need some controversy.
All right. Okay, here we go. Participation, if you talk to folks in the biz, in transmission, many of them will tell you that participation is already part of this. That there's participation in transmission planning, that there's participation in permitting. And it is often the permitting where people talk about participation because they think about, those community meetings and the landowner engagement and things like that. The planning process also requires stakeholder engagement. They are not connected, right? The planning and the permitting are two very different processes, as we've already discussed, at very different scales. The stakeholders are not consistent. And as often is the case, who gets to decide who a stakeholder is?
Once again.
And there's arguments for, I think a lot of strong arguments for broadening who is considered a stakeholder. And that participation should be inclusive and consistent throughout, right? If you are bringing in someone 5 years down the line when it's just time to take their land, or a community, right? Or even local governments, right? The later you bring anyone into the process, the more they feel they are being strong-armed, or likely are being strong-armed,
right.
And I think it's important to note here that this report is not suggesting that there is going to be some consensus view that just by talking to more people, suddenly everyone's going to agree on where a transmission line is going to go. But it does say, let's really be frank. Let's take an outside perspective on what, particularly at the scale that we need for decarbonization, on what these impacts are going to be. And if we need to reach scale and speed, and we already know what some of the pushback is going to be, what are ways that you include people, include local governments, include local authorities, include all of these impacted groups more actively and clearly in a process, which is our last P. I keep running into process. Instead of this, again, it's not even bifurcated, right? Because it's more than two.
Yeah, whatever. I don't know what the word is. Multiplicated.
Yeah, there we go.
So that's participation. And when we talk about solutions, I want to come back to this because it vexes me. But let's just get through the fifth P, which is this process, which is sort of meant as like a meta P, gathering up the other ones. And the point of the report here on this fifth P on process is just that there really isn't one. That the process is so fragmented and so different from place to place, even sometimes within places, that there's just it makes for an environment where people trying to develop power lines don't really can't know what to expect, or how long it might take, or what they might need, or like how they should go about it. So this I think, I mean, is there more to say about process other than like there should be one?
There should be one. Well, and so it's clarity so that folks enter the system, right? So that you get private capital interested in it. Because it's not even high risk. It's just wild uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because capital is not necessarily afraid of high risk, right? You can find high risk capital, but risk and uncertainty are very different issues. But then the other thing about process is that it can create scale. If nothing is ever repeatable,
right,
then you can never get to scale.
Right. So at the very least, you want a process where people endeavoring to enter it can have some sense of what's going to happen, what the steps are, right? Like, what are the criteria for getting through it?
Because you can also get better.
Right. So those are the 5 Ps. And when you talk about, this is a mess at multiple levels, a mess at basically every stage. I mean, I think people listening by now should have gotten the basic idea that if you're trying to build a transmission line, you're in a foggy planning process, and then a foggy multi-part capricious permitting process. And then all the while you're trying to pay for it and the people you're trying to get to pay for it don't necessarily agree that they're getting benefits or don't have the patience to sit around waiting for the other parts of the process to work out. So it's really a wonder that any of these things get built at all, and they really kind of don't. Like
Right.
as you said at the beginning, this is why they're not getting built, even though we desperately need them. So we got to talk about solutions to these things. The way the report sort of frames solutions is, sort of solutions that are more on the kind of private sector, private actor side of the spectrum versus public. And I wanted to sort of interrogate that, get into that a little bit, but just let's go through some of the private, sort of more private sector oriented solutions that come up here, because I have questions about some of them. Like, for instance, you say permitting reforms. I guess this would be a good place to bring up my question about participation, I guess, because this is sort of framing the rest of the discussion. Because what I've heard so far is there's just so many steps and so much of a mess and so many delays that it's killing all these projects. When I hear participation, what that brings to mind for me is more process, more delays, more difficulties. Because I what I have in my head is, I'm really into urbanism and all these sort of density issues and all this kind of thing. And when you talk to urbanists about participation, what they hear is all these siting boards and historical preservation boards and all this just endless delays. And so two things about participation from that angle. One is just more delay and more time and more difficulty. But two, it's also the people who participate in the participation venues are not representative of the full range of beneficiaries. You know what I mean? Like if you're trying to build an apartment building near a single family neighborhood, it's the homeowners that end up participating, right, in the process, and they all want to block it. And the people who might benefit from the apartment building don't exist yet or don't know about it yet and can't show up at these meetings. So participation is just very fraught. So I guess I wonder, when you talk about and so a lot of these solutions, like for instance permitting reform, that sounds to me like a gentle way of saying overriding some of these local barriers, basically just being able to come in and say, no, like, enough discussion, we're doing this, which pulls in the opposite direction of more participation. Do you know what I'm saying? So I guess I wonder how you reconcile this in your head, more participation versus the need for speed and cutting through some of these things.
Absolutely. What you've described is a pretty common perspective that folks have about what participation means. And I'll counter that participation doesn't mean everybody gets a vote.
Hmm.
We are not sending every transmission line to the ballot box.
Hmm.
Right? It is just about when we pull out participation to be separate from permitting and separate from planning, right? It is about ensuring that consistency of communication, giving people information, also identifying who is encouraged to participate, right? In the examples that you are giving, people who have the time and financial resources to participate,
Right.
are the people who are participating, right? And so being clear on who should be involved and what it takes to get those folks involved. And that includes, right, that's not just landowners within states, that's also tribes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's different, there's lots of different stakeholders here that should be considered. The other piece, I think what's helpful is I'll give you an example. I'll give you a permitting example that's been proposed that I think speaks to this without just sounding like, some magical dream. We'll just allow more people a voice and all of a sudden it'll work out.
Yeah.
Right? I think the example,
and it will be faster.
Right. It'll be fine. Just trust us. So Senator Whitehouse introduced what's called the SITE Act. It's streamlining interstate transmission of electricity. Oh gosh, I don't remember the date. I think it was 2 weeks ago. So Senator Whitehouse and Representative Quigley both introduced the SITE Act to their respective bodies. And the SITE Act proposes that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that FERC, have siting authority on lines that touch 2 states or more and have 1,000 megawatts or more of capacity. So on the one hand, this speaks to what you were saying about overriding, Now, I would argue it is not overriding.
Specifically, that's taking permitting authority away from states and giving it to FERC.
I would specify that it is identifying that authority which is appropriate for the federal government to have, because it is a federal benefit.
Right.
It is aggregating benefits across diffuse benefits.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So is it overriding or is it reassessing? We can
Appropriately identifying, let's say.
discuss in the comments. So that's the one piece. But the other part of that bill is that it says, folks with often, landowners impacted, or it's 100 foot. It's 100 foot within the right of way. So it expands it. It says more people can consider themselves impacted than just within 100 feet of this right of way. It's a wider width of impact. It also has specifics on how much notice they get, right? What the process is for being heard, and that they get essentially their day in court, right? And that's the piece that is really informed by some of the efforts we've seen in response to pipelines under the Natural Gas Act.
Right.
And this is, I think, a helpful example of how you can create solutions that streamline while still including and even broadening participation.
So FERC